I'm with Anthony.
Morning.
Today, the crowd will probably be smaller. I've been sending announcements weekly, and I've decided to just let people come that are interested in coming, and rather than having them feel any obligation, and just sort of find the meat of interest that would potentially be more interested in digging into this conversation. Anthony and I have known each other for about 4 years now, I think.
Yeah.
And met at a sober retreat, where I talked about the mental obsession, and Anthony and I started to discuss it in relation to his life. So we're here today. I know some others. Here comes Jana. Others will trickle in. Good morning, Jana. Here's
Morning.
MK. Wow. MK all the way from Tempe.
Hey. Looking
Morning,
sharp,
you're
buddy.
talking about me.
Looking good,
Yep.
Jana.
Hi,
I'm at
Anthony.
I'm at Rockstar Fantasy Camp. We got to play with Michael Anthony from Van Halen yesterday, and then today we're playing at the Whiskey and the Viper Room.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really
So-
cool.
Anthony thinks this is recent, but I mentioned to him it's been going on since we met. He's been in rock and roll fantasy.
I'm on Kauai.
Wow.
Nighttime.
It's
What time is it
beautiful.
there?
It's 6 a.m.
Wow.
Morning bird.
Kauai is gorgeous. It's so beautiful.
The good news is I know I would have never made it as a rock star. Day 4 of this shit and I'm done. I'm like, okay, can I go home now?
Long days. But Anthony, what we were starting on was that point that is often sort of the thing. Am I good enough? Do I have enough?
Yeah.
Can I do enough? All that kind of thing. And to think the same way will create the same feelings. And if we're here to do anything amongst us, and Jana and you and I and MK and I have known each other now, what, about 3 years? And Jana about as long as we've been doing. I think Jana and I met at the beginning of the podcast, which is 2.5 years or so. So we've been in
No,
this
it's a lot more than
conversation.
that, isn't
It's
it?
more than that.
Yeah,
It was
Jack.
pre-COVID. It's been like almost 4 years.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me the podcast started in, well, I forget the exact date, but it seemed to me it was about 2.5 years. But I could certainly be wrong. Time seems to fly when I'm not thinking about it.
Well, I know when our star pupil joined, it was June of 2021, because we were in Riverside and Gabe had made us all so excited about him joining us, and that because Haley died in July of 2021. So that's, and we had already been at it for like a year by then, or 15 months by then.
So it's some time.
Yeah.
It's a chunk of time. And my sense is that we've obviously grown in our discussion and looked at many different aspects of it. And that actually peering over the edge of any defensiveness, any limitations, any reactiveness that we find, it's not always easy. And you said to me last week, Jana, that had I said what I said last week 2 years ago, you'd have been angry, you'd have been resentful.
Yeah.
So I want to make a point, and Anthony, it's to your point too about this recurring idea about not enough, not enough, not enough.
Yeah.
To the thinking we do, whether we think we're doing it or not, those consequences are always revealing to us the thinking we're doing, even when we don't think we're doing it. And to your point, Jana, when I work with people and start to push them up against their limits, because I'm intentionally doing that. I am interested in finding out what the limit is, and I know what it is when they start getting reactive and defensive. And I've had people get extremely angry. They get to that point where it just snaps and they get completely defensive. And I mean angry. I mean, don't talk to me for a year, sort of anger or more.
How is Katie doing?
She kissed me goodbye on the way to yoga this morning. Thank you. But the point is that to think of those things, Anthony, as things that maybe shouldn't be happening when they're happening is one of the great mistakes in our process. And Janet, to think that getting pushed to those limits are doing anything that's starting to actually identify the limits of our thinking. So all that's happening, the reactiveness is actually on hyper awareness, because when we're kind of not pushed in that direction, it's kind of like, okay, we got this. I'm managing it. It's okay. I'm at the center of that thinking. But when I get to the edge of that thinking, now that's at the edge of the thinking, and that thinking could go away. And I feel that my life depends on that thinking, that that's a major threat. And so the reactivity is natural. The resentment is natural. It isn't something that shouldn't happen. I would suggest it will always happen. And for it to happen and not be noticed as something that's giving us feedback in our experience and clarity in our experience is to miss the benefit of the consequences we create in the thinking we do. If we're in a relative scheme, which the physical universe seems to be, we're always going to, here's how the absolute reveals itself. If I create something, it immediately creates a consequence. Immediately, not a little bit later when I finally have enough pain to feel it. It's immediate. And if it's immediate and I'm not paying attention to it, I'm pretending it's not there. I'm thinking that numbness is a better source of, it's my defensiveness, my numbness. I think it's my source of salvation because I'm afraid simply to admit what's happening is happening. And in the present, everything that's always happening is happening. So to think any of it, any small part of it or any large part of it isn't happening is an insane idea to imagine that reality isn't happening simply because I think it isn't happening. And that's a major cog in all subsequent thinking.
That's interesting.
So the point is, to think of this as something that shouldn't be happening or we want to stop happening is to ignore that we're the ones creating it. We're the ones making it. We're the ones deciding on the thought that we're maintaining to have it that way. And to think that we only want to stop it is to ignore the responsibility we have for starting it and not really notice that embracing it and saying, wow, if I'm experiencing this, I'm doing this. I'm causing this. This is not some byproduct of some strange confluence of mystical creatures that are coming after me, that we've invented and created to justify that these evil spirits are around us. If those spirits are evil and based on something other than love, they don't have any more power than our lies do about the things we think we are and the ideas we have about the self we're constantly trying to fix.
And the reason I was in a little bit of a funk too, because I was talking to Jack about something just not right, but I won't say who it is, but there's somebody at the camp whose dad is a famous rock star. And it's like, fuck, why does he get to have the dad that's the famous rock star? And think about how much fun I could have.
So, Anthony, your parade of reasons that you offer to justify what you're doing are always trying to make sense out of the insanity of thinking that somehow
I don't
or
like
other,
that part. It's not like I create that part because it makes me feel good. That's the part that I don't like.
Anthony,
But you're still creating it.
if you're listening to what I'm saying, you're creating it to give you perspective of what you're actually thinking. You're thinking of yourself in relation to what other people have and what other people do. And on a comparison always finds imperfection in that it always finds more or less of something else. So it isn't to say don't compare. I'm suggesting when you do compare, you will always find more of something and less of something else. The more and less you're finding is only based on the comparison that Anthony's doing.
Yeah.
Now, let's think of an absolute source. Let's think of an infinite source. You can't, if the opposite of something infinite is infinite, it's because there is no difference in it. There is no distinction in it. There is no separation of it. So there are no parts and pieces to compare in it. So if you compare something to itself, even within this relative experience we're having, if I compare Anthony to Anthony, it's perfect. Because there are no differences in that comparison. There are no exceptions. There are no diminishments or there are no more or less. There is no more or less than that. It is as it is, period. The difference is we think the imposition we create in comparison causes the imperfections, or we think the imperfections exist and miss the fact that we're creating them in the comparisons that we're doing. It's okay to compare. The brain is designed to analyze. If it sees a mountain that's 20,000 feet high and says, you know what, we're probably not getting to the top of that today, it's probably good comparison, right? It's utilizing its analytical processes to actually deal with this experience we're having. To dismiss it as something it shouldn't be doing is no better than making believe that all it's doing is creating imperfection. It's actually telling you the imperfection you're seeing is being created by the comparison you're doing. So again, we get back to responsibility. And if there's a responsible source in the universe,
I was like, where are you
beyond,
going with all this? Where are you going with this? Until you said responsible. I'm like, okay, I get it.
So if we're responsible if the nature of existence is responsible, because we're a product of that nature. We are not the creator of that nature because we think of it. We are thinking of it because we are products of it. And if that is our essence, then it is essential to us, not an optional optional essence. It's just the source of our existence. And it's not the source of my existence, it's the source of our existence. All of us, everything and everyone would be included in that. Now, that may seem a little far-flung to start considering everything, but when you start considering everything, that's when things don't change, because now you're looking at everything that's changing as everything changing, and all of a sudden all that changes is now stabilized by seeing it all in total. So it isn't to say you need to spend your days contemplating this, but if you begin to concede it, the wobbly nature of the reliance on thinking as who you are, as yourself, starts to stabilize, because you start seeing it clearly and say, oh, this is something I'm doing. I'm doing this, which means I can absolutely not continue to do it. I'm free not to do it. When I think I'm not doing it, I feel condemned to continue to do it. That's the source of the addiction, of the addictive mental process. In the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous, we admit we're powerless over alcohol, but the book says alcohol is a symptom. The bottle is a symbol. It's telling us the disease centers in the mind. What is the brain telling me about alcohol? I can handle it. I can control it. I can drink it. I can do what other people without the allergy do. And I can do it without any consequence. And time again, I maintain the evidence shows me that that's impossible, and yet time and time again I try again, because I keep maintaining the thought that the lie about alcohol has power. No lie has power. The mental essence of this discussion in the first step is that lying has no basis, no denominator. We can add to the numerator all we want. The denominator is always zero. It zeroes everything out. There isn't anything there. That's why it takes so much time to focus on it and repeat it and chronically think about it. We then feel the thinking is doing it to us, rather than actually noticing we're actually choosing the thinking to do something that can't be done, and wondering why things begin to feel impossible. And then think life is impossible, and all that extended version is coming out of looking through the lens of my own understanding that is now a lens of misunderstanding, because I've been in this insane state making believe how I think is reality and truth, rather than how I think is how I think, and what I imagine is what I imagine. And when I think in those terms, I start seeing things as they are in terms of something I'm doing in my brain, and that certainly can have an influence on everything I do in the universe, but it certainly doesn't become universal. It simply becomes something I'm doing, something I'm choosing as a body, as a human. So simplicity couldn't be simpler when you begin contemplating that the nature of our existence is absolute and does not change. Something that does not change couldn't be any simpler, because there are no parts or pieces. There is no greater or less. There is no more or less. There is no then and there. It's always present. It's always here. It's always the present state of our awareness. It's a meditative contemplation for humans. So it's standard state of peace. harmony, love, generosity, because it's always giving. It's always as much as there can be. And to even contemplate that dissolves the conflict of thoughts very quickly, which is effectively what meditation is. But I'm talking about an awakened meditation, meaning as you go through your day, rather than 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night, where you feel better. But even those 20 minutes, if we're willing to look, we seem to find something that's very peaceful and very knowing, simply because we're looking for it, rather than making believe all of the other conflicts that come up are reality, rather than just simply potential conflicts in our experience, potential things that we don't expect, potential things that we miscalculated, problems coming out of our adherence to the idea that reality is our thinking, and then we make more and more desperate decisions over and over and over again, wondering why things don't get better, they get worse, and then start trying to feel better all the time, trying to get over things all the time, trying to feel that we're condemned and I just need to survive the moment. It's all being induced. It's an induced form of insanity. Seeing and hearing things that don't exist, talking about things to ourselves is one of the hallmarks. We're really just thinking to our thoughts. We're talking to our thoughts. Nothing wrong with that. We can do that. We can contemplate. But when I think it's who I am, and that who I am constantly seems to have a mind of its own and do a thing that I don't have any control over, I'm ignoring the fact that I've created the appearance of reality in the name of reality, when in fact I'm simply looking at what I'm imagining as reality. Major conflict. And I'm doing it, I'm creating it, and I'm maintaining it by talking about it as though it's real. Constantly talking about the somatic feelings I have, the effects that I create and manifest, as proving that these things are wrong in me, rather than proving that the thinking I'm doing is wrong, period. So our job here is not to try to get over these things and feel better about them, but start noticing that we're the ones creating the limits, that we can be very reactive about when somebody helps us get near them. And one of the differences in relationships is that when somebody helps initially, when this happens, people can get angry and say, you're toxic, I don't want anything to do with you, because they're actually coming up against the toxicity of their own thinking. And on the other side of it, you begin to realize that people who are willing to do that with you are actually your friends, friends, whatever they amount to, because they're actually giving you an opportunity to see something that without them you would not be looking at. They're giving you visibility to what you think is invisible or you're oblivious to. So in a relationship, especially marriage, it's a great place to find that. I'm not suggesting I always do it. I don't. I have plenty of blind spots that I come up against, but I find when the reactiveness is there, it's time to actually contemplate. Exactly as the book says, pause when agitated, restraint to pen and tongue, taking a breath and saying, oh, this is indicating to me that I know better. If I didn't know better, I wouldn't have that indication that something's wrong. Creating rituals to feel better cements the idea that there's something wrong that I'm not paying attention to, and that wrong is intractable, and that now it's reality rather than a thought I'm having that I simply refuse to admit I have anything to do with. That's the core of the wrong. And we're feeling it. That's what we're feeling. We're not feeling life is impossible. We're claiming life is impossible to once again avoid the impossibility of the simple thing we're doing, which is making believe that a thought is reality, making believe that imagination, fantasy is reality, effectively. Doesn't mean we're not thinking, and it doesn't mean we're not imagining. It means we're thinking and imagining. Thinking and imagination is reality. So that conflict is core, central. I don't know that there's any simpler definition of it, but I'm sure that there is. I don't think there is, but I imagine that there's probably a better way to say it. I struggle with the way I say it. I piss people off all the time. But I don't always find that as a failure. when I look at it, I'm realizing that I'm actually giving myself an opportunity, or my experience an opportunity, if there is no self to give that opportunity to, but giving the opportunity of the time I spend to actually be with people through that and be there when they're ready to continue, rather than shut them out because I've been shut out. My sense is we don't do that well socially, and it's why we have so many versions of fights and wars going on throughout the world. To get to those limits and think the only thing we can do is defend them with our life is to make believe that that thought actually is our life. It isn't true. Class dismissed. So talking about it and looking at those edges and those ends, honestly, doesn't mean we're not doing it or supposed to not do it and all that. It just means that we're doing it, we're doing it. We can talk about it. To do that freely is not something we tend to do very well. And what I found, I used to do this a lot one-on-one with people, and there was a lot of clarity because there was no counter conversation going on. It was just me and them. But when I opened it up to three people, I started noticing the dynamic changed dramatically. And when we get 4 and 5 and 6 people, the much more of the social dynamics that I might run into out on the street during the day start to come into play. And it shows me how that dynamic can seem much more complicated, but it's really my own ineffectiveness and my own inefficiencies and my own deficiencies in thought that I'm realizing because I have been excluding people for so long, and starting to expose myself to them would also expose the deficiencies and the lack and the shortcomings and so forth. But it's kind of like a tennis player starting to play with the professionals, or Anthony, you're starting to play with the professionals.
Yeah.
You get a really, you play with the best, you get a really clear view of what's wrong with your game.
Yeah.
Now that's an advantage, rather than something to pretend isn't happening so you can get back to the bad playing you're doing with people that are worse with you and think you're the winner. And
I
that's
heard Elon.
not uncommon.
I heard Elon Musk talking. They asked him a quick question about what it's like being a CEO or starting a company. He says it's not as great as you would think, because you only focus on the negative stuff. Everybody brings you the problems. If it's working correctly, you don't deal with it. So all your role is dealing with the worst parts of the company. And so that's kind of
how do
makes
you
sense
see that?
with
Yes.
yeah, it makes sense with my thinking. I'm always focusing on what I need to fix, because what's working, I don't really need to concentrate on. So that's why I focus on the next.
So let me mention something. If reality is reality and doesn't need any work, we are not struggling with reality. What we're struggling
Right.
with is what we think about reality.
Right, exactly.
And that isn't reality. If we're struggling with it, it's a clear indication it isn't reality. And I'm talking about reality in the absolute sense for anyone listening for the first time or someone coming back. To begin to digest this is to begin to admit that you've always known it, that there's some part of you that has had some sense that something going on wasn't right. And the idea that it's something out there rather than something we're doing in our own brain, in our own choices, is to miss the advantage of recognizing that we have been operating through a filter that we have presumed to be right while seeing everything else is wrong. And yet that wrong we can see. Isn't it interesting how clearly we can see what's wrong with the world while we're struggling with the thinking we're doing?
Interesting.
So that projection and that attempt to get away from it is what impulsive, reactive, compulsive behavior is all about. I want to get away. I don't want to sit with this. I can't sit with this. It's impossible. Why is it impossible? Because we're considering things that are absolutely impossible in a present moment that is absolutely possible. We've got it all, and we're trading it in for nothing, trying to make nothing work. We have an imposter as a self, as though it's who we are. So we basically have a joke for a self, and the joke's never funny when we take it seriously. Just like thought. We take thoughts as thought, That's not taking them seriously. That's just actually taking them as they are. It's a thought rather than this is my reality. This is my truth. People argue that all the time, largely what arguments are based on. So if we take it seriously, we become very serious about it, and it's no longer funny when in fact it's a joke. It's literally a joke. And we've all had those moments in here where we sort of laugh. Sometimes we're laughing at the seeming expense of somebody else, but if you begin to see that, that's how we are designed to operate, to use the perspective that everybody else offers us as a chance to see what we often can't see. If I had something wrong with my eye, I couldn't see it except my eye would be obstructed. We can't see our own eyeballs. And yet our eyeballs see. We see each other, but we don't see our own face the way others see it. When we're looking in a mirror, it's backward. So these thoughts that we think are real turn everything around too. Gives us the impression that the whole world is backwards, and now we're operating on a backward basis, and that's putting the cart before the horse and all the other terminology that's been developed to talk about this openly and then not look at it honestly, in my experience. So you might notice in the face of some of these ideas, if they're accurate, I am not a truth teller. If there is truth, we all have it. And it's what we're all free to think what we want. So it's what we're each thinking that we're doing to cause any problems. It's not what you're doing that causes my problem. It's what I think of what you're doing that causes my problem. We each have that. It's idiosyncratic, meaning my own. That's the ownership I have, is the decisions I get to make in my thinking. I have absolute freedom to think whatever I want.
Funny
And
that
if
it
what
uses
I'm
the word idiot.
Exactly. Thank you. I was thinking of you when I actually I was thinking of that, Anthony, because we talk about that. Because it's easy to be idiotic. It doesn't make me an idiot if my thinking is idiotic. But when I think who I am or my thoughts, I think I become an idiot. Wouldn't that be a lot less than somebody who's smart? And now I sort of drag my feet through the world looking at anyone else has any indication of smart and think, oh, if only I could be them. When in fact, all I'm doing is maintaining a thought as though it's me, as though it's real, as though it's entrenched and absolutely impossible to change. Well, it's always changing. That's the irony of thought. Laura Alice said yesterday on our morning Saturday walk that what she started to do to help loosen her grip is that when she feels afraid and thinks the only thing that can happen is the imagined worst thing that she's imagining, she starts imagining things. She said, well, if it's imagination, then I'm just going to start imagining other absurd things, like a spaceship could land any minute and actually provide me with everything I need, and aliens could show up on my door and I could win the lottery, and start thinking of things. She said, if I'm capable of thinking, if all I ever seem to think is the worst case all the time, if that's what plagues me, why not start thinking of other ridiculous things? And she said it brings her a chance to start laughing at the absurdity of the thing she thought was so true, to think it's only the worst thing. She said, I've never had the worst thing ever happen. Some things have actually happened that weren't as good as I hoped for, but they've never been the worst thing I imagined, when it's all bad and all wrong. But my sense is we're so attached and so addicted to the thinking that when we're thinking worse and we're seeing it clearly, we think that means the worst thing is going to happen, while in fact the worst thing is happening in our thinking. We're doing it presently. It's not a future tense, it's a present tense. And the tension that's being created in the present, actually the present isn't tense until we think of it as something that we need to escape. So if the worst can be imagined and then actually seen as flexible by imagining other things that are either sane or ridiculous, the flexibility of this becomes obvious, and the idea that that permanence exists becomes ridiculous too. There is no permanent. Thoughts are always changing. we work hard to try to keep them the same, thinking we need to fix them, when in fact the idea that they're going to be fixed is broken. They're always going to be changing. They're already not what they just were. The combination, the conflict, all that stuff that's going on is constantly in motion. It's what emotion is about that motion. If I'm trying not to feel what I'm feeling, I'm trying to fix the state so that I can get rid of it as though it exists separate from a process that I'm completely involved in. You, everyone else, not just when I'm with you, but everyone, everywhere, everything, everywhere, all the time.
It's funny how the little things could get me so mad, because we had to leave the studio where we were at and gather all our stuff. And of course, I forgot my charger cable there. So I was so mad that I got this new nice charger, and I had to get another one. Then I just found it right now as we were talking. It was in my briefcase, the whole time. So I've been so upset on this little thing instead of focusing how great time I had, and then for nothing, I really actually had the thing. So it's
Well,
just funny.
imagine, Anthony, that size component of that little thing becoming so much is the same concept and based on the same presumption that nothing, absolutely nothing, and I'm talking about nothing, not even a sense of no things, because nothing meaning not existing, meaning fantasy, other than the fantasy, becomes everything in reality.
And now it turns out that was the best thing that happened, is that I thought I lost it, because you just mentioned that. That's a great analogy of how this little thing could be such a bother, even though it's so insignificant. And then it turns out it was for nothing. It was so small, and it was even nothing lower than that.
Well, consider that reactiveness, and I do this. Listen, I misplace things and feel like an idiot. I go through this whole cycle, and where is it?
I always lose everything. All I had to
yes,
do was just look one more time.
Think of the words. I always lose everything. Think of that.
Yeah.
Now think of that in relation to actually making believe that your thoughts are reality, and now reality is lost, always lost. You can't find it. Think of the impossibility of that. And those words are perfect, Anthony.
Yeah. And
think
it's
of
funny
how
how
clear those words are.
Yeah.
And you're using them in relationship to something like and I can understand when you lose a charger. Is it an Apple charger?
Yeah, it's the new one, the speed charger that I fucking never spent the money on to buy it, and it's always screwing me up because I'm so cheap on the not getting my speed charger back.
But then I understand the magnification, because that's the most expensive charger you can buy.
Well, it's just so necessary. I mean, it really fails me at the worst time. I need the phone so bad, and because I'm so cheap that I didn't buy another one because I knew I'd lose it, and then I'm just devastated. And then so I got another one, I lose it, and I didn't really lose it.
So think of that as a metaphor, an active metaphor for this idea that reality is not here and we need to find it. And the only reality that's here is the one I created. And now I'm condemned by it. So all those little instances are giving me a chance to see the narrative I've developed, the story I'm developing.
I always
to
lose
feel
everything.
A complete victim. Exactly. In all ways, all of a sudden I lose one thing and I always lose everything.
At least it's not everybody's taking something for me. I guess that's even worse. If I go, I always lose everything, at least I'm taking responsibility.
Yes. Well, but think of the broader implications here. If I think my thinking is reality, I think there is no other reality. Now, reality in its essence no longer exists in my thinking. So I've lost everything. This is that idea in sobriety. They say the basic fears are not getting what you want and losing what you have.
Yeah.
Think of that in relation to thinking that your thinking is reality.
Yeah.
And then realizing that that's a delusion, that's insanity. Now, all of a sudden, anything I want is going to become delusional, so I never have anything. And I've lost everything I thought I could get. And then in the same single thought.
And this brings me back to the very beginning of every meeting. I always go, what am I going to get out of this? I mean, he's not going to be able to fix me another week. It's not going to work this time. And then
but it isn't up to me, Anthony. This is not, my job is not to do for you what you are absolutely responsible to do. Nor is my job to tell you that you should be feeling better about the things you're doing that are wrong, because I would say that would not be a service whatsoever. And that if the right things don't need your attention, what we're here to do is start talking about the wrong things openly and say, wow,
Talk
I
to the
do
hand.
this stuff.
Janice says, talk to the hand.
Well, I
Hey,
couldn't figure out my new chargers, Anthony, and I gave 2 perfectly good chargers to my grandson saying, these are obsolete now, they won't work. And then my friend gave me a new one, and all I needed to do was buy the cord part and they would have
oh,
worked
yeah.
correctly. But I couldn't see
We
the
all
brain
got our
damage
stories.
of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
another
couldn't
great
see.
aspect of the story. It's so perfect that you don't need to replace the whole thing. I didn't
I
lose
know.
you. And
Isn't
this
that
reminds me,
crazy?
Jack, just real quick before I forget. Well, Jana knows Craig. He was our guru, and every area has their own guru. You know, the guy most sober, and then knows his book like Picasso. But I said, so can you teach me about spirituality? He goes, Anthony, it's an inside job. He's the guy that he was like a newcomer. Somebody told me at the very end of his whole thing, 40 years sober, whatever, he was like, he didn't like Bill Wilson. He said he didn't really know what he was doing. He was like a total newcomer at the very end. He said he didn't identify as an alcoholic. He identified as, I have alcoholism. He goes, if I'm diabetic, he goes, that's not who I am. I just have a problem with sugar. Like, you know what I mean? He was fighting everything.
But the issue is, though, isolating it to being an alcoholic and not seeing that the being of that is the mental problem
Yeah.
has been overlooked in this discussion, in my experience.
Yeah.
And
I suffer from alcoholism. I'm not an alcoholic.
But if the disease of alcoholism and drug addiction and gambling addiction and eating addiction and all those other disorders are disorders, then we've put the cart before the horse, because we think thinking is the creator of reality rather than reality the creator of thinking.
And I just realized why I was so upset. When I called you, I couldn't put my figure on it. Everything's going great. The thing is that actually getting to play at the whiskey isn't really what I thought it was going to be. That's what I'm upset, because I'm older now. It's not really my band.
Anthony, do you know how many times you've explained that same thing to us here? In different terms.
This is the first time at the whiskey.
I get it. You think a new place and a new time is different. That story has been the same thing you've repeated. You try to clarify the wrong.
Well, I had to do it for myself. I couldn't understand why I was not, even though it's the way.
I know, but think about that. You've got to do it for yourself so that you can now say, myself that's insane makes sense.
And this is the problem. Here's the exact problem I'm suffering, right? That's what I want to identify. Exactly. I have to put my finger on it. If I can't touch it, then we got a problem.
If we're here together, let's look at what is actually happening rather than, if I'm helping you reinforce the stories you've been telling for so long, and I've heard them long enough to recognize.
Well, but I have to get ready for my performance. So it's not like I'm just making this shit up out of the air. Like,
you're making it up out of the air.
But I'm getting ready. Like, I'm going to shower to go there. So it's happening.
Anthony, the thing we're talking about, you are making up out of thin air, because it doesn't otherwise exist than the thin air that you're trying to breathe at an altitude that will suffocate you. So if we're honest here and looking at this, and this is, if we're doing any good for anyone listening, it would be to begin to concede these aspects and start to notice that if we're building on a basis of insanity, we are not building sanity at all.
Well, but you can't just start off with basis of insanity. You have to establish, like in anything, you have to establish that.
Oh, you've well done that.
For the listener, I mean,
look at humanity. Look at humanity. We're the only species on Earth that basically has set things up to kill off our entire species. It's not some evolutionary process of extinction. This is a deliberate, frightful step in a direction of actually killing ourselves off, our bodies off as a species. We're the ones doing that. So I'm not singling you out, except in this discussion, do you feel singularly, but we're all involved in this. So to think of it,
it's easier to swallow that way. It's so funny too.
What's that?
It's easier to swallow. Like, if you're making fun of all of us, I'm like, okay, that's cool. But if you're just making fun of me, then it's like, well, wait a sec. Now this could be a problem.
But you see, self-consciousness is defined as undue regard for appearance. And when you think your appearance is worse than everyone else's, you don't feel good. And yet, when everyone else's gets worse than yours, you feel better. Think of how sick it is that we need other people to be worse off so we can feel better. Is that wrong? Glaringly Poor quality thinking.
Yeah.
So, Anthony,
Which is not my real name, by the way, for everybody listening.
To the degree any of us do any of this, we're polluting, contaminating, and influencing our decisions with a level of desperation rather than inspiration. The inspiration is always there, like the rightness is always there. The difference is whether I express it or not, whether I am actually choosing from it or choosing from this other conflicted, desperate state that I create literally in my own imagination. And it isn't real, but the effects feel real. And so the idea of fixing it seems to be the only thing I can do by paying more attention to something that doesn't actually exist. To see it actually begins to allow it to diminish because it can't be taken as seriously, just like alcohol, and the idea to drink sort of blows away when all of a sudden you realize I have no power. I've been trying to have power over this. I have no power over this. What we really
Can you
don't
do me
have
a favor,
power
a quick
over.
favor, Jack? Because I've been in this mode all week. With the
Yeah.
person that you had a guru, whoever you really would go to the meetings because you wanted to talk to and you loved their sobriety, what were their sayings? What was the guy's name? Who was this guy or girl?
I don't understand the question.
Like every time I'm in a meeting, like, or I always like Craig. He was the guy. Like I would make sure to go to meetings that the guy's name was Guy, because he would have the greatest stories, and I could identify to him. Like, did you have somebody like that in AA?
I mean, I have hundreds of people like that.
No, but one wasn't there. The guy. You don't have just like for me. It's you too. Part of this are just. Can we just take a moment and appreciate how amazing Jack is? For all
Well,
of
Anthony, if you're missing the point. The amazingness
that would be
of
good.
all of
I would
us.
say to him, tell him something. You go, Anthony, you're missing the point.
Well, it isn't unusual and it's common, but I would like to redirect to the point I made 5 or 6 minutes ago, which is
Yeah,
we all have this. If this thing we're talking about, like Elon Musk talking about people coming to him to fix things all the time, that's
yeah,
his job as the CEO. He's looking,
yeah.
how do I put the fires? How do I keep it on the tracks?
Only
How
the
do I do the
worst
thing
things. Only the worst parts of the business.
okay. So if all we're dealing with are the worst aspects of our thinking, constantly thinking that we're going
Yes.
to fix it, yet
Yes.
we're the ones creating the problem,
God, yeah, you're right.
that makes no sense. I mean, that
Instead
would
of
be
looking at where
absurd to.
yeah, we got to start looking at where it's coming from, and just instead of saying all these problems,
Well,
like
let
they
me
go to
mention
Musk.
it. Let me mention it for the 700 or 800th
I know
time.
that's what I'm
It's
saying. I see
coming
where it
from
comes
the
in this
idea
analogy.
that you think your thoughts are reality. You think your imagination is reality. That is
No, I
fantasy
think
is
I
reality.
personally think it comes more from taking it to the CEO example. Like Musk has all these he only looks at the worst
Anthony,
things. Wait,
Anthony,
let me just
Anthony.
finish this point.
I understand. Listen,
Well,
you're
let me
going to
just
push
finish
for your point. Anthony,
how it ties
Anthony,
in there,
when you're
just for my
pushing
own.
for your
I'm doing it
point,
for me at this point.
when you're
It's
pushing
just
for
for me
your
at this
point,
point.
hang on, hang
No,
on. I want to break
just so
this
I could hear
cycle.
it.
I want to break this cycle.
All right.
I want to interfere with that cycle.
All right.
When I
Well,
allow
I
you
won't
to
remember it is the
continue,
problem. I was trying to
Anthony,
remember it, but that's
good,
okay.
good, good. You know why you don't remember it? Because there's absolutely nothing to remember.
I'll
You're coming
go
up
with that.
with
Yeah,
new
I like that.
rationalizations,
I worry about trying
new
to remember
reasons,
everything. I don't have to always try to
new
remember
reasons,
everything.
new reasons, new reasons, new
Yeah.
reasons, new reasons to
Yeah,
justify
you're
the
right.
insanity.
Yeah, I could feel relaxation right now. My whole body just changed. It's just like I don't have to worry. I always worry. I always feel like somebody's going to test me on everything. Then I have to know every answer, and I don't have to know it. I don't know it. I don't
Anthony,
care if I know it.
let me give you a better example. You already know it.
Yeah, that's well. I don't know
You
about
know
that.
that nature,
I don't
Anthony,
know about that.
Anthony,
I'll go with I
if
don't have to know it. I don't need to know it.
Anthony, I'll go with you don't think you know it. And again, thinking becomes the culprit.
I
Let me
love you,
mention
buddy.
to you,
All
let
right,
me
I'm going to go
mention
on
something.
mute too. I'm going to put it on mute so I don't interrupt you. So hold on, go on.
Thank you. So, Anthony, that thing you just did that I have allowed you to do many times, I feel I become complicit in helping you undermine the capacity of your awareness by making believe, making those points that are pointless are somehow or another giving you credit that's undue. Think about the definition of self-consciousness. Undue appear or over undue regard for appearance is the dictionary definition that I found. Undue regard for appearance. You're trying to make things look better, sound better, appear better, but they're not better if you're trying to do those things. To begin to notice that Musk's issue, CEO and all the other labels and all the other terms and all the other variations and all the other things, was pointing to that we have a rightness that's already in place. And for humans, it's called right here, right now. The right attached to here and now in those double word commentaries is because the rightness of reality is present always. It is where we are. It is what we have. If reality is here and you know that, that doesn't mean you know every single little circumstance that you've been fighting to think you know so that you could think you finally know, so that you could put the plug in the jug or the plug in the thinking so that all of a sudden you wouldn't think obsessively anymore. That obsessive thinking has been trying to do and achieve what you already have, which is an absolute state of peace. And quiet, by the way, and stillness. That's the basis of existence. It's the basis of our existence because something that doesn't change has no conflict in it. It has no potential for struggle. There are no bits and parts or pieces, none whatsoever. We're not even talking about nothing because that would just be the negation of things.
Yeah.
We're now talking about something that is so unfathomable to the consciousness that we've been having that when we know it, as you've had those instances where that knowing was there and you can't make sense out of it with the thinking. And that's a good indication of the fact that your knowing is not what you think. You've had those instances. We've all had them because we're all absolutely aware, making believe we're not. The beliefs we create to try to prove we're not aware cannot sustain, they can't be sustained. That's what obsessive thoughts are. Constantly coming up with new things, new versions, new aversions to try to avoid what we're doing. It can't work because an infinite source never changes, never goes away. It's never not here. It's never not as we are in our essence, ever. And we know that. We know better, and that's why we struggle. So I'm including you in that, my friend.
Yeah, I just realized why I'm also unhappy. I was playing with my favorite guitar player in the world yesterday, but I was too embarrassed.
Apparently, the mute is no longer working.
But I didn't play what I thought I really knew.
Anthony,
I should have said,
it's
hey,
just another story. It's another story. Let's stick with where we were and are now.
I didn't rather than myself.
Anthony, you're trying to come up with a rationalization and it's just going to keep feeding. It's all feeding off of a story that's insane. You already know what you know. You know what you know. You can't not know what you know if there's an absolute knowing, awareness in the universe.
Well,
Can't be possible.
Learned from it. I learned from it.
What's that?
I actually learned something from it. I know more now.
I know, but if the basis of the thinking is insane, what you're learning is more insane thinking. And that's the issue of this conversation is to start to concede if the absolute is absolute.
Okay.
You already know everything you need to know. And all the rest of it is just an opinion. It's just an assessment. It's just an estimate of how things are going. To manage life's terms effectively. If you're running into walls and keep running into walls and finally say, wow, walls are solid. And if I keep running into them, I'm going to keep running into them. Coming to terms with that would be learning, right?
I think Jana's got a light bulb on Jana right now.
What's that?
I think the light bulb just went off for Jana.
Literally.
How so?
He sees your lamp.
Oh, the sun's coming up. Here.
Let me suggest the light is never out in an infinite sense. The light of knowing, the light of life, the light of light, the light of love is never dimmed. And
Yes.
it's never shadowy. That's beautiful, Jenna.
Yeah. Kalapaki Bay.
What a great segue.
For anyone listening, we're looking at a beach in Kauai where Jana is. She's normally on Maui, where she lives. So now look at all of that nature and consider nature. Nature is operating as nature operates right now, everywhere. That includes us, doesn't exclude us. Nature is not some other thing that we look at and say, wow, nature's so incredible. That's our nature too. We share that. It's absolutely part of our nature. And the essence of that nature is largely unseen. What we see are the effects of it. What we see are the projections of it. What we see are the transformations of possibilities in our world. And our bodies are constantly transforming, constantly. Deepak talks about the fact that every X number of days, certain aspects of our hair are redone and completely new. Our bodies, I forget what he says, it takes 3 years or something for all the cells in it to be renewed. That's nature. We don't think about that. It's happening, and it's happening right now. And if it's the basis of all that's happening, and we begin to consider that we're absolutely a part of everything, there's an equality there, Anthony, because there's no discrimination in that. There's no inequity. So the ideas we have about more or less and all that start to dissolve. And you see that they're literally impositions of thought. And impositions become depressing the longer we maintain those positions. They just begin to bear on us because they're telling us we're going the wrong direction. It's like Orville and Wilbur. Every time they crashed, they knew something was wrong with the wing, but they persevered. That's why perseverance in the steps is one of the principles. It doesn't mean because we fail, there's no possibility. It means what we're doing in relation to what's happening now is failing.
And I just remembered why I'm upset, Jack. Even though I'm getting what I want somewhere, something else isn't going my way and I'm upset. That's the reason I'm on here.
Anthony, you keep trying to explain the insanity of the core thought that your thinking is reality. You're looking for an answer within the insanity of your thinking, the irrational nature of your thinking. You've been doing this as long as we've been talking.
Yeah, but and I don't like that. I let one thing.
You obviously love it. You love it to be doing it. Anything you're doing, you want to be doing, or you wouldn't be doing it. And to think otherwise is how insanity works. Even the big book says in step 6, we may think we're entirely ready, but there may be some defects we're not ready to give up. Because do you know what they say, Anthony? What it says? We may not give them up because we think we love them too much. And Bill says, that's not a problem. Just say, okay, I'm not going to do that today. He says, just don't close the door on forever, effectively. He's saying, if I can't do it today and I'm not going to do it today, that's okay. Just don't think that means forever. So you begin to open and open and open and start to say, oh, the imposition of these ideas are things I'm creating and things I'm maintaining, especially by thinking I have nothing to do with them. So one of the reasons I want to break that cycle, Anthony, and interfere with it is because I've gotten frustrated by my acquiescence to allowing that to happen and to witness it and allow it. And I've realized that is exactly what enabling is now at a new level of awareness for me. And enabling is the idea that if I let you go on, you're going to be better off because you're going to get what you think you want. But if you're thinking insanely, what you want is insane to think, period. So the thing you're trying to get all the time, you just keep repeating with different times, places, and spaces, but it's the same question. It's the same thing that, now I get it. Now I get it. Now I get it. Let me tell you, you already got it. You already are it, period. When you begin to concede that, a lot of that thinking is going to dissolve because it only is maintained in the illusion of appearance as reality. It isn't real. It isn't true. It doesn't exist other than your own thinking. That's what idiosyncratic effectively is: your ownership, your person, the thing you're doing. It's something nobody else is doing but you. And yet, if we're all doing it seemingly differently, we're doing the same thing with the same thing you're doing by announcing new faces, new places, new times, new events. That isn't reality changing. That's just the story changing and evolving.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And keep in mind, Anthony, you know this. These things couldn't occur to you if you didn't have a basis in knowing. And the only thing we're doing with insanity is we're the one bringing the problem to the CEO, and we are the CEO and the problem maker, constantly bringing the same problem, asking it to be constantly refixed
That
over
was
and
the
over
point
again.
I was going to make when you wouldn't let me make. That's what now you just, yeah, exactly. That's what I wanted to remind myself.
Okay. Excuse me for interrupting if you were on a new path, but the
No, but it's
velocity.
okay. That's just part of it. I don't have to, I can take anything because I already know it. It doesn't have to be my path. That's the way, right?
Well, but keep in mind, your thinking is always going to be unique to you. That is one thing that you have. The one thing we each have is a brain in a skull that thinks if we're thinking. There are people who aren't, and I'm not excluding them in this because they would also still have a sense of knowing if they're part of any life form, regardless of how diminished their capacity may be. They absolutely have a sense of knowing that isn't diminished. Its expression may be diminished, but it's absolutely inherent. Just like every bug and every insect, and all of the essence of life is all essential to this same life seeming force that we talk about. So you have great capacity for intellect and imagination, Anthony, because I've sat with you and watched you go through this. It also means the greater the intellect, the greater the potential you can develop something that appears to be a maze that you can't figure out how to get out while you're the one that created it.
Yeah. And then
you can't create the maze and then pretend not to know how to get out of it.
And this
But
morning,
you can actually pretend, but it's not possible that you wouldn't know.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't know this morning. I didn't know this morning when I was like, how is this going to get fixed? I didn't know Jana was going to have the sunrise from Hawaii. You were going to be right there explaining it.
Notice that
right there too. I was watching MK's expressions and MK's expressions.
Jack, can I say something?
I hope so.
This reminds me of when Anna and I hang out with people that want to talk about the fact that they want to stop drinking. They love hanging out with us because they want to stop drinking. And they're like, all they do is talk about how they want to stop drinking and how awesome it's going to be. And then the minute they get away from us, they call us, they check in with us, and we are supportive as we can possibly be because we're like, yeah, why wouldn't we want to help somebody? Speaking of enablement. And then 2 weeks go by and Anna will send me a message or call me and be like, hey, they were all getting drunk all night on Saturday. What happened? I thought they were looking to get better. And I said, honey, it's real easy to be sober around sober people, but it's very challenging to go off in the world and then, change because you want the change.
That's great.
So coming back to your enablement comment about Anthony, I obviously haven't been around for some time. I've been doing things, dealing with things that I need to deal with, and it is a little challenging because there is an essence of enablement, and I know there's also an essence of you don't want to abandon the idea per se, and I have a lot of appreciation for the things that Anthony talks about because it allows me to reflect and pushes up against a lot of things that I'm dealing with or maybe considering just the way I am, and hearing it out loud is almost like the elephant in the room, if you will. But it does get to a point where you're trying to figure out, am I helping? Or am I just enabling and this just not getting any better? And then that's an even more challenging place to be.
I think that's the essence of addiction, though, is the idea that we have done much as in society and as individuals to encourage people to get worse by not being honest about what we're seeing and try to make nice. One of the survival instincts is fawning. Flight, fight, fear, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawning is trying to make nice to the threat. Right. So in a real instance of if you're trying to make nice to a car doing 90 miles an hour and you're in a crosswalk, it's probably not going to work. Right. If you can reduce the threat of somebody who's psychotic and talk gently to them, or a dog that's rabid, and be gentle in your process, that might help reduce the threat. But my sense is animals especially recognize fear in people and become afraid of them as a result of their own awareness, just like we do. So if we're filled with fear trying to act better than that all the time and act like it's not happening, it doesn't mean it's not happening. It means we're trying to pretend it isn't happening. And that means our body's taking the blow while we're pretending psychically that denial is actually working, that ignoring and going numb to everything is actually working. So that sensitivity you're talking about, it's really a razor's edge between help and not help. And seeing that is starting to say, wow, that's, when I function during the day, the question is, and the actions I take, are they moral enough to be valuable beyond the instance I think is so critical? Is something I'm doing here actually maybe a little more important than the immediacy of this knee-jerk desperation I think I have to solve? And often when I'm timetables, for instance, when you go out for the day, being in real estate, you have schedules. Things always happen that you don't expect. So all of a sudden the schedule's at risk. So the thinking you did about the schedule, if the more reactive you are in your own experience, the more obsessive you are in your thinking, the more those things are going to seem just tantamount to a crazy day. Everything becomes, you lose your focus driving. Now you're really creating a threat. I had dinner recently in Century City with a group of guys that were celebrating someone's first year of sobriety. And they were all in the restaurant business. And one of the kids said the best thing he'd learned so far was slow down to go fast. His boss told him. He could see that he was running through the restaurant. And he said, I don't understand. What are you talking about? He said, you know what happens when you drop a tray? Do you know how many people's attention that requires and how much time it takes and how disruptive to the process it is? So if it takes you 40 seconds longer to get to the table with that tray compared to the 40 minutes it will take and the disruption of the process and the customer's experience, would it be worth doing? And the impelling nature of this idea, this sort of impulsive nature of trying to constantly fix something that we're constantly recreating, creates all of the desperate measures to end up being even more desperate because the manifestation of circumstances are now going to really put us at running red lights because you're late. You're running the yellow light and get broadsided. It happens. It may not happen to most people, but when it does, it becomes obvious that that wasn't the best thought. And to think those thoughts initially is to say, wow, if I'm thinking morally, if I'm thinking principally, I'm thinking of those things as possibilities, not to figure out whether I can reduce the risk of it, run the peril of it potentially happening, but because it might not, I'm gambling that it won't. Starting to say, wow, I don't want to operate in any of those fields that put anyone at risk, because on the way to doing that, I'm actually putting everyone else at risk too, not just my own experience, not just my own family, not just the people I think are close to me, but everyone else, all of those people I'm coming across.
Yeah, the crossroad you're speaking of, I mean, I'm dealing with a very challenging week this next week because the last couple of weeks have been very challenging. A lot of things drastically changed, and then I go into this overdrive of trying to plan, project, solve, prepare, adjust, and go. It just goes on and on and on, and I'm just making more notes and more notes and more sheets and try to come up with more narratives and involve more people. And at some point, I have just gotten to this other degree where I'm just like, oh, I'm just done. There's no point. That is clearly not healthy. That's not sustainable. But you get to the middle of that where it's like, okay, well, am I just quitting on this because I don't want to do this anymore because it is the best choice for me to stop? Or am I just coming up with the path of least resistance and throwing in the towel because of learned past behaviors that aligned with that? And I will say that sobriety, because I've only been sober for 4 years, has changed a lot of the way I process it, because me and Anna joke all the time, like, oh, I'd be out last night. I'd be at the bar having a drink because I would rather numb, whatever you want to call it, all of this away and just figure it out another day, as if that would have helped in any regard.
So I want to offer a couple of thoughts.
Please.
The numbness of alcohol, the numbness of drugs, the numbness of gambling, the numbness of all of those things is the psychic anesthesia of denial, all starting in the brain. If we think what's happening isn't happening, or it shouldn't be happening while it's happening, that's a pretty big leap, right? If everything's happening as it's happening now, and we think it shouldn't be happening or isn't happening, we now are not just opposing what's happening around us, we're opposing everything happening everywhere. Pretty impossible. Same as thinking our thoughts are reality. We think there is no other reality, meaning we're turning our back to reality, which in fact, that's impossible because reality is always real. So I'm going to suggest to you as a thought, and what I learned was that I manifested the problems I was facing to help me see that that was the curriculum I was still in need of learning. I was actually creating the circumstances I thought were unexpected. And I was creating them from a level of my awareness that was much smarter than the thinking I was doing. So I thought I had nothing to do with it until I saw how uniquely I was seeing everything as specific to my thinking and my experience and me. And I thought it's impossible I couldn't be involved in that manifestation. It's impossible that all of these tidbits are just on their own. Think of how it would have to be. The same thinking I give to the self I call my own, because thinking of itself creates this sense of self-centeredness. But the self-centeredness of thought is more thought-centered in thought, not me-centered in thought, not a self of me. If I've been assigning my life to that self and thinking I was going to fix that self, now I've manifest problems that I think all have a life of their own aimed solely at me, singling me out. All of these problems are coming to get me. Somehow there's some evil force that's aiming itself at me. And I'm manifesting those things to finally get my attention, because apparently I'm not sensitive enough or willing enough to notice that the numbness, the numbing agent of denial, is still in full play. I'm pretending what's happening shouldn't even be happening while it's happening. How crazy is that? Rather than say, these things are not happening accidentally. And it wasn't until, and I used to say coincidentally, until I really defined the word and saw that it means coincidence, happening simultaneously. How could it be happening simultaneously in my experience and have nothing to do with me if I'm the one having the experience? How would that be possible? It's crazy. You know what I've realized too is that it's actually an argument. It's a death wish. It's an argument for non-existence to believe that I have nothing to do with everything. Think about that. The only way that would be possible is if I didn't exist, if I didn't have a body. I would suggest that is a primary presumption of suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, and eventually killing oneself. And addictions in all forms are suicidal tendencies, every one of them, because the body is suffering a consequence that we don't think is happening, just like we don't think we'll overdose. Very few people overdose intentionally, which is why it's designated as different than suicide. But it's absolutely suicide, because in the same vein, everyone knows people have died from the same thing we're doing, and we happen to think it won't happen to us. Here we're claiming that we're not even doing it, while at the same time claiming it won't happen to us. And you can see that we're insane. That contradiction can't be reasonable. It's completely irrational.
Well, you touched on something earlier, and I was doing I heard someone speak about this, but it was, I mean, stress is a part of our life, regardless of what we want it to be. I mean, you hear all these stress-free, how to live stress-free. You hear that repeated so many times as if that's the path to bliss. And I know you like the planet and the way that the environment works. And so I figured, I don't know if you've heard this, but the biosphere down in Tucson, I guess they built that, or they put it into play in 1991. And that was obviously created to mimic Earth. and to
Yes.
recreate the environment and everything that was in it. So there's trees, animals, lakes, everything that it could possibly recreate on another planet. And they noticed that the trees grew faster than the trees that were outside of the biosphere. And quickly, they also noticed those trees started to fall over. And it was because they did not have wind stress.
They weren't growing.
No, they grew.
They weren't
and
getting
then
stronger.
they had no strength to stand, and so they just fell over.
Yeah.
And it's funny because the more research I've done into that biosphere, everybody sees it as a failure because of things that didn't continue as they should in normal conditions, instead of just understanding and learning from the fact that the world is a normal condition. The planet we live on is always in a normal condition, whether it's whatever it may be. And it resonated well with me because clearly I'm dealing with more stressors. And of course, I want them to end and stop and go away, or to whatever shape or form, whether it's just quitting or whatever you call it. But then I hear something like that, and I think, yeah, that's part of growth, is these stressors that can come in, and you can deny them and avoid them, but that if that's your goal. But it was very enlightening to hear that, trees by default need stress.
Great analogy. Have
You know,
you
it's
heard of
interesting.
forged steel? You know where they get forged steel from?
Hitting it.
They put it back into the fire. It's that second time where it breaks it down, and then the molecules reassemble, so it becomes forged steel.
I think they also hammer it, and it reshapes the molecular structure. That's how the samurais made their swords in 600 years ago and more. So a couple of points to your point, MK. The other thing that happened in there was that the whole structure of if you look at the psychological things that went on, some things started to break down amongst the few people that were in there. And one of those people was the physician in there was Dr. Roy Walford, who is from Venice. And I knew him many years ago after he was in that. But there was a psychological dynamic that fell apart amongst the people who were isolated together. And I forget exactly what happened, but it seemed at some point that something went wonky with that, and it never quite survived the length
They didn't have the
expected
wind
to.
stress test. Really screwed them up. They
Well,
kept falling over.
But to that point, it isn't, when we're talking about induced stress, induced insanity, we're talking about creating a stress that we're not designed to bear, which is very different than the stresses we are designed to bear that actually strengthen us. This induced insanity has us get better at being insane. And the idea that we get better being insane is to constantly try to perfect insanity by constantly doing the same thing over and over again, thinking we're going to get a different result. And the real insanity isn't thinking we'll get a different result, but actually becoming aware of the result and constantly still focusing on the thinking. We know what the result is, and yet we still continue. That's even sicker than the idea of trying to get a result that we can't predict, that we think will at some point happen. So the other thing is that in the city of Los Angeles, whenever you plant a new tree on public property, the ones they put in the curbs, they require that a post be put in with a support for the tree. So all the trees are weak to begin with and tend to fall over because they never get the natural interaction with what's going on that strengthens them. And if the interactions that we're dealing with on a very regular basis or on any basis aren't real, they aren't helping strengthen our own metabolism and our own immune system and our own parasympathetic system and our nervous system. They're actually doing the exact opposite. They're undermining the entire metabolic immune, the whole system that we have to build on. They're actually killing it, which is the kind of anxiety that separates the stress that you're discussing, because like bridges all are designed to bear stress. It's not something they shouldn't be doing. It's something they're built to do, which means they're flexible. They aren't completely brittle and unmovable. They seem like they are because the amount of movement is small. But if they were brittle, they would break very quickly. Any movement would snap them. They're designed to move. Concrete actually moves. You ever sit on overpasses and you're parked, or your lane slows down and you can feel the passing cars over the little berms, wherever the seams are, you can feel there's a little movement in that concrete. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of tons of concrete is flexible. Our thoughts are flexible because they're always changing. To think they're not is simply a thought. To think that thought is true is where insanity begins. It's not the thought that causes it. It's the idea that it's true that starts the whole volley of consequences that seem to be unstoppable and unchangeable, when in fact they're constantly changing and can always be stopped. If we can start it, we can stop it. But if we focus only on stopping it, we're ignoring the starting of it that we're doing, and as a result, not paying attention to the cause, thinking it has nothing to do with us. So those manifestations, I would suggest, if you start looking at them, what I did and do is start saying, I am creating this, all of it. Everything I see, I have something to do with, to the degree I think it has to do only with my thinking. And it starts to allow me to say, oh, but I also have a greater sense of knowing. So the knowingness, the intuitive nature, my sense is thinking was designed to express knowing. And that intuition that the book talks about is knowledge beyond reason, means it's not thinking knowledge, it's a knowing of knowing knowledge. It's an awareness of awareness. What the gurus and the Maharajis and the yogis and all these people that have been talking about for thousands of years, that were not our thoughts. And to think I am my thoughts is to create an impossibility that is insane. And the only reason insanity is maintained is because we think, again, backward, that it's sane. We continue to foment it by making believe it's sane. So, Anthony, to the storytelling we do to try to figure out the rationale behind it, when it's chronically thinking that that's the knowledge we need when we're denying the knowledge we have, does not help. And I'm not suggesting that my interruption wasn't interrupting something that would have made the point I eventually made, because I trust that you were onto something there. But the cadence and my getting familiar with it is that I have an expectation of you to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it again, because I know I do it myself in my own experience, whatever that self is that I call it. And as a result, anticipate it and can plan ahead for it. Morning, JP.
Hey,
So while we sort of summed all that up, I want to jump to JP. He's coming in a little late, but we still got about 30 minutes. And I wanted to make some things I considered during the week in relation to our conversation last week.
well, I've had 16 concussions, so I don't know what you're talking about.
You're lucky. We were talking about belief, and I was suggesting that belief starts with the idea that if we think thoughts are true and real, we create a natural defensive nature because we're believing them to be something they're not. And the only way to maintain that is to be reactive and impulsive and compulsive. Why are we compulsive? We're trying to escape the misery that we're creating in the defensiveness of something that is literally indefensible. And if beliefs are born out of that, which I would say they are, because that's a central belief that we're creating reality in our thinking. If a belief is born out of that, the adrenaline that's being caused, adrenaline is basically used as a fight, flight, freeze, fawn mechanism. An instinctual response to a danger that is being produced to create energy we need to either outrun or outfight or outdo whatever that threat is. But if the threat we're causing is mental and we're releasing adrenaline constantly in the name of an emergency that is completely fantasy, That's how our bodies, as I just went through and described in the discussion, this undermining of all of our stress and anxiety, undermining all of our different bodily functions or systems, metabolism and parasympathetic and nervous system, cardiac system, vascular, all of it. It undermines all of it because it creates tension and pressure. And pressure creates inflammation, and inflammation is notoriously involved in just about every major physical ailment in some degree or another. If we're doing it as an induced insanity and we're triggering this function in our body, it isn't the instinctual nature of releasing adrenaline is the body's attempt to help us survive. And in fact, in the addictive sense, it's actually killing us. So it's obviously revealing that there's an opposite consequence to what is claimed to be its purpose. So anyway, that's what came out of the lack of memory.
My lack
Thanks,
of
you
memory.
guys.
You never
So
know
my-
what's going to come out of my lack of memory. That's for sure.
How do you
Well,
feel
then,
about belief, John? What's your feeling on that?
Well, the conversation, it's a multi-faceted conversation because he's pulling in. Jack is pulling in this adrenal structure to it because belief causes things to occur, right? So belief makes things a bigger thing than it was. Like, and so he's correct. He's absolutely correct. Believing that you have a broken foot, causes you to limp, right? So then all of a sudden your limping causes you to think about other things that you have to avoid because you have a limp, right? And then pretty soon you're listing to starboard and, your SI joint goes out and so on and so forth. So yes, he's absolutely right about the adrenalizing, of the system. And, he's absolutely right, in my opinion, that inflammation is the source of everything.
problem, disease-wise.
Yes, of course.
In terms of disease.
Right. And whether, the academia wants to validate shit, that's their prerogative. And, it's, or that's their, idea of how to keep us dumbed down. And I think that this program is, and I'm riding off on my horse called Tangent also, but this program here, if you want to call it a program, I don't bite my head off. But this program here is about, clarifying thought. It's thinking about your thinking, but we're really, the most interesting part to me is we're clarifying thought. So I'm trying to, if I can figure this out so I can show you some. So guys, how do you switch this camera to face the other way? For a second. How's it work?
It's okay. We can keep looking at you for a little longer.
I can't even figure out how to rename myself. So
Anthony, you know this shit. How do you?
Yeah, you just touch your picture.
Touch my picture? Okay. Nothing happens. Okay. Anyway, so
there's the rename.
I research this shit pretty heavily, right? So you have an understanding of what I'm researching here, but to understand it clearly, we have to talk about what belief is about. Belief is about taking a thought and giving it credibility, which impacts us and others.
Yeah, which insanity does.
Yeah. Okay. So that's one little robust name for a belief, but we can call belief, anything. We can entitle it, anything. So any form of unhappiness is a belief, because happiness, HAP, right, means to be. So happiness, it doesn't have to be encouraged. Happiness is there for us to feel until we believe it's bad for ourselves or for others to feel that way. So we can be bad for ourselves. I sent Anthony 2 weeks ago, I think, this whole like list of what shoulds mean. All shoulds are belief. And I think I was in the car when we talked to, we spoke like last week or something, maybe last week. And
Your memory's coming back.
yeah, it's temporary. But we spoke about, and I told you that in her 3 sentences, and I lost her name, I'm sorry. In her 3 sentences, she was very eloquent. She used the word should 3 times. Huh?
Jana.
Yeah. Sorry, I apologize. And she used the word should 3 times in 3 sentences. So we understand. So I sent to Anthony, that all shoulds are beliefs because they're judgments, right? If I should do this, right? So that means that if I don't do this, I could be bad for myself. You follow me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the nature of the addictive thought. The obsessive thought is that it's never good for us. It's always eating us. It's literally cannibalizing our experience in the name of saving us.
And again, it's not just this word. It's every word, right? It's not just that. And I understand that, your focus and mine, on staying sober and I understand that. And I understand that Billy wrote a book, and I understand that. But it could be anything, right? And that's why you don't have that, Anthony. You don't have that text with all those shoulds.
Yeah, I just don't have it in front of me.
But John, I think what you're getting at, if I'm hearing this correctly, is that when I have an idea and I obviously the language the consciousness that we think we have as humans is all in language. Very often. It's something that we can explain, something we can justify, something we can share. If I'm thinking those thoughts I have about those words I have is reality, I'm missing the potential for all of those words to be misunderstood or reinterpreted in different ways by everyone, because they're just words, they're reference points. They're not definitive, though they definitely have definitions. The definitions and the words, the meaning of words often changes in time. They're used differently in time. The connotation of them is used differently in time. They're interpreted, I would say, differently by everyone. And when
I'm sorry, go ahead.
When I'm thinking, my thinking is truth and reality, I only hear what I think people are saying, and I only see what I think is happening. It's not what is happening, and it's not what people are saying. So the disconnect becomes very obvious and a very thick basis for interaction, because now I'm interreacting with people rather than actually interacting. And that's, in my estimation, what you were starting to point to last week, is why belief has always been central to war and killing and major catastrophic events that humans have caused deliberately.
Well, that's actually your analogy, which is so eloquent. And you use it all the time. I would say it's second to Columbus, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that it doesn't matter, because the thoughts can flow, but as soon as the thoughts are loaded and they become belief, basically being something bad for yourself. Let's not even talk about others, right? Let's just talk about ourselves. Then we are unhappy, right? And that the unhappiness is about that we have a belief that we are being bad for ourselves. That's what a should is, right? We get into a should, right? And all of a sudden we say, I really don't want to do that, but I should do that. Bingo. There you go. Then you have a thought that you can be bad for yourself by not doing that. That's belief. That's the structure of belief.
Well, but keep in mind, if we're believing in something true because we can't prove it, and yet we believe in it once, and all of a sudden the proof is in the utilization of it, the availability of it, very different use of belief than the one where we're believing in something untrue to become true because we believe in it.
No,
That's
they're
the
all
obsessive.
you just happen to get back on something that you do a lot, is that what you do is I say, well, what is true? And you say true is true. If it wasn't true, right? But that's not what we're doing here. Let's just focus on
Hi,
what
how
we're
is
doing.
it?
Invigorating.
I saw you.
I'm sorry,
Somebody else was talking. I muted Jana.
I didn't hear you.
I muted Jana. She was talking.
Oh, somebody stepped on me. I couldn't hear it. So when you look at this stuff, you really have to understand that the thought, the thinking, as you say eloquently, that the thinking, right? It's all about your thinking. Well, the thinking is in flow, right? And the thinking has no power, right? But as soon as you think, because you're colorblind, that this pen or this marker here is blue, right? And I tell you, because I'm not colorblind, that this marker is pink, right? And your belief in it that it's blue could cause a war.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're talking about the same thing in different ways, but the essence of it is obsessive thinking, making believe that any obsessive thought is the idea that something untrue is true or something true is untrue. So it's a naturally inherent conflict, and it's an inner conflict. Mental anguish, emotional turmoil, all of those things are byproducts of that. And the idea that righteousness is ever right based on that means that the righteousness is attempting to turn wrong into right. So the only action that's going to occur is going to be wrong. I want to jump though to one other point, JP, before our time's going to run out, and I don't want to get too deep into this where we lose it.
It used to go on for hours.
I know. We haven't been doing that for my scheduling and for the audience, just to give them a little clip and then come back at some point with another clip. But
I think you're setting them up for the right hand, aren't you?
I don't know. I'll leave it to them. I'll leave it to them. But here was the broader point. If I believe in something real, let's say I believe in reality, and let's just, for the sake of this conversation, consider that reality is reality. I know that you don't like that because it serves the point, but in an absolute sense, that's how things are. Reality is reality. What's absolute is absolute. And it's all the same thing. Reality, truth, absolute, infinite, all of that stuff is not divided in anything other than words. They're just words we use to reference something. But if reality is reality and I believe in it, it doesn't take any more than the initial belief, because it's really, most of it is unseen. What we witness in terms of the manifestation of forms that we're witnessing is a projection of reality. And the essence of reality seems to be invisible. It doesn't mean we don't have a present awareness of it, because we're a byproduct of it. If I believe in reality is real, I immediately don't ever have to believe in it again, because I know how to utilize it. I immediately realize, oh, my problem has been in believing in things that are unreal as real. To your point, my problem is in thinking thoughts that are untrue are true. My problem is in thinking thoughts that are true are untrue. My problem is in the collision I create in my thinking, not thinking at all. Thinking at all is designed to do what thinking does, which is to think. How I utilize it is the problem I have with it. How I misutilize it is the problem I have with it. How I mistake it for reality is the problem I create with it. And we each do that, and we're free to do that. It doesn't make the fact that we have that right. Doesn't make the conclusions right because we have the right to make those conclusions. And if I feel condemned with the absolute freedom I've been given, it isn't reality condemning me, it's my thinking and my misutilization, my mistaken identity that I create in this idea of a self that I think I am, when in fact the I am is the essence of all those other things in their essence, just like a tree doesn't do a lot of thinking about what it does, just like MK described the trees that toppled over in the biosphere because they didn't have the wind and to strengthen them. Nature wasn't there. There was a missing aspect of nature. There is no missing aspect of nature if we begin to see that nature is natural and we're a byproduct of nature. We are absolutely built on a platform of nature, no matter how academic we get about the descriptions and the isolated ideas we have and the theories and all of the other stuff. It is as it is now, always, complete, whole, not debatable in its own essence, but certainly debatable to us, especially when we think the essence of who we are is what we think. Everything becomes up for grabs. Everything becomes a potential fight in that realm, while in fact it has no effect whatsoever on anything infinite, anything absolute, anything unlimited, anything omnipotent, omniscient. None. So the vanity of it becomes obvious, the grandiosity of it, thinking it can do anything other than impose misery on our own experience, conflict on our own experience, and thus others, as you point out. Everybody is a byproduct of anything I do. If I'm intimately connected to everything, everything I do affects everything and everyone, always, in all places. It may be imperceptible, but if I'm capable of pretending I'm not thinking what I'm thinking right now, I've created my own imperceptibility by going numb to what's happening and make believe that that's true when in fact it's just an imposition caused to make believe I can be irresponsible for what I'm doing. So that's a mouthful.
How come I look so old and you look so handsome?
First, probably a
It's the
perception.
headphones. You need the headphones, John.
I got some sun yesterday.
The headphones. Okay, so I have an analogy for you. First of all, you cited it very well, that I disagree with reality is reality. And you cited it. So we don't have to talk about it because you know that I'm going to disagree with that, right? Can't define something with the same something.
You can in absolute terms, because you know what the opposite of something absolute is?
I'm listening.
Absolute. Because there are no divisions in it. It's indivisible. That's the realm that we're discussing here, to begin to see that that's the primary essence of life. And to think thinking is the primary essence, to deny that that exists, when in fact denying it confirms it, because it doesn't change it.
Okay, so your absolutism is a belief. Okay. And you give it to me, right? I got you. But let me give you an analogy, right? You deserve this, right? I say that, right? And then I have to tell you that you don't get what you deserve. You get what you get. And if you believe that you get what you deserve, you will only be unhappy. That's my analogy to what you're just talking about.
Yeah, well, I would take it a step further to say we always get what we want because we always want what we decide. Our choices are always made on the basis of want, so we always get what we want. And to think that we don't is to violate the premise that we're free to think what we want, to claim that we're irresponsible for it, which is irresponsibility is simply a possibility of thinking. It's not a possibility of an absolute responsible state.
All right. So with your answer there, I will tell you that if you want something and you don't get it, you're fine. But when you need something and you don't get it, you're unhappy.
I would say we always get what we want.
Negative. I want a fucking Mercedes. I don't know why. I don't fucking like those German people anymore. But I want a Mercedes. I didn't get a Mercedes. It didn't appear in my backyard here.
Okay, right? But what you want is the education. What you want is the education that you're getting from the experience of not being able to manifest a Mercedes simply because you think you want it. You're getting an education immediately. And what's the education? that steps might need to be taken to have that happen.
Let me
That
say it
you can
again.
want it and you can think you need it.
Let me say
And
it again. Try to split them up for us, right? If you want something and you don't get it, you're fine. If you need something and you don't get it, you're unhappy. That's the truth.
I don't know. I think a lot of people are unhappy when they don't get what they want. But I
You
can't
can
speak
get
for them.
past,
I
can get
would
past
let
the
anybody
want,
listening speak to that point.
but you can get past the want. But you can't get past the need because that turned the want into a belief.
Well, and it's also turning the thought into reality. And the only reason we only expect what we thought was because we think the thought is real. Those seem to be needs when they're just wants. If we need something, we don't do a lot of thinking about it. We get it. We tend to eliminate all the other various routes and go get water when we need it, or food. We tend to figure it out.
We don't need water or food.
Okay.
We don't. We can
Okay.
stop eating and drinking right now. People
Yeah,
have done
of course.
people, right?
Yeah,
So that's not a need, right?
People have died from it too. So
That's
it's
exactly
certainly,
right. We'll die from it. But
yeah.
that doesn't mean I need water, right? It means I decided not to drink water. I'm on a hunger strike. I'm not drinking water. I'm not fucking eating. I don't care what you say, Jack. I'm not doing it, right? So that's not a need, right?
For
but
the
I'm trying
body,
to
it would be.
clarify something here because I'm trying to get away from reality as reality. But you brought up this thing about want, and there's a definitive difference between want and need, and the definitive difference is that one is a belief.
Okay.
So if you don't get what you need in your belief, right, you are unhappy.
Okay. So go back to the thought. If you think the thought is real, the thing you want is probably not going to be healthy and not achievable because it's insane. If the insane thought is asking for what it wants, you're not going to want what you get because the insanity of admitting you want it would dispel the rumor of the thought being true.
You're qualifying, right? You're qualifying. I don't think you're doing it intentionally, but you're qualifying the thought, right? But that's not, you don't have to qualify it. It's across
Exactly.
the board. It's across the board. So across the board, a need and a want are very different because the need has belief behind it.
Okay.
And you brought that up, not me. Don't yell at me for that.
I don't tend to yell. I tend to be insistent, and I tend to.
You raise your voice. You laugh loud too.
I hope louder.
Can we just
All right,
fast forward to this part? Can we fast forward to this part next time, please? Because I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for the input, JP and Jack.
Something that Jack has said before. JP, something Jack has said before that I was kind of blew my socks off, amongst other things, was people will go as far as, I'm gonna butcher this, but basically there's people that want to be right so bad that they will manifest and wish for and create the thing they did not want just so they can say that they were right.
Is that you think I'm doing that?
No, not you. I'm saying that.
Oh,
but in correlation to your conversation. So when you're saying that it's like a belief, it's like, well, but they're also like coincidentally, they're trying to create the thing that they actually don't want at the same time.
Because you think that they can be bad for themselves. That's Jack believes that we can be bad for ourselves. That whole AA
if you've listened to me at all, I'm suggesting there is no self to be bad to.
You don't have to say it all. I've been listening to you for 25 years.
But if you're getting the essence of this, if you're getting the spirit of this, rather than the conflection of words that can be conflated and all that stuff, the essence is there is no self other than an imagined thought thinking of itself that we have determined is ourself. It's just a thought thinking of itself. That isn't who we are. And to MK's point, the idea that we want to be right, any of us that are maintaining, and I would say we're all doing this, we're all maintaining ideas that we think are true, which are beliefs, that aren't true, and as a result have this reactive internal tendency of trying to prove we're right only because we're wrong. The initiation of that proof is constantly trying to prove we have nothing to do with what we're doing because we don't think we're doing it, rather than begin to recognize that the conflict that we're fighting for is actually evidence that we're doing it. To start to see the totality of our experience rather than the individual aspects of it as though they're separate, is to start to see the seamless nature of an absolute nature rather than simply think of it as relative and I'm different than you and we're apart. We're operating on the same platform. And of course, you can argue that reality isn't reality because you're free to think whatever you want. But I would say that's the beginning of admitting that there's some insanity in the thinking to imagine. It's like saying 1 is no longer 1 and 2 is no longer 2 and 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 anymore. It's changed. When in fact, those mathematical components are part of this universal scheme that this entire universe is built on. Mathematics is this universal language. I'm not suggesting that it's infallible because the best brains are still learning about it and still learning how to apply it. But the structure that it's identifying and bringing into a field of view that can be looked at on paper is right now exactly as it is, without my thinking about it, without your thinking about it, because our thinking doesn't change it. Our thinking simply changes our experience and our own interactive capacity to function, and to function literally, meaning we're reading the body language, we're reading the perceptual characteristics of the experiences that we're creating, etc. Hang on, I have to unplug this alarm.
Thank God. MK, before he interrupted me in the middle of my sentence, are you following what I'm saying?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm laughing at your response. Yes, I'm following.
Okay, so MK, I used to have really nice hair too. No, I did. I mean, I but I don't anymore, right? So if I go to the mirror and I start to say, I have hair like MK, there would be, in your opinion, you would be some delusion there, right?
Agreed.
And if I use that analogy, right, and I say that I have that fucking same hair as him, and you guys go fuck yourselves, because I know it, because I have a really interesting mirror, right? So that would be my belief, right? And that would be cause, as Jack says, for war, right? Right, we would have a war. Right? We decided that we're going to have a war because you don't fucking believe me when I'm talking about MK, and it's true, and I'm combing it right now. So,
but the war out there is starting. The war out there is starting with one in here, right here.
All right, listen. I know this is your show, and I know that you can interrupt whenever you want because you're practicing it all the time. So what?
I do it well.
Understand that I have a relationship with this man, right? I really do. I have a fucking connection with this guy, right? So sometimes, I have a connection with him, and whether that's some kind of a metaphysical thing or whatever it is, what I'm trying to tell you is that one of his modalities is to interrupt and to override, because he's not doing that on purpose. He's doing that because his thoughts are flowing as he hears this little prick that comes. And then he's all thorny, right? And he feels the prick. And then you start talking. And he talks louder and faster until you shut up, right? So all this stuff, this reality is reality, and all these notes that I just took is about the belief structure. And the belief structure changes the thought structure. Am I being clear?
But not reality. Doesn't change
Because
reality.
reality is reality, right? It can't change.
The reality isn't changed. And
Exactly.
the difference
I
is
disagree with
if I know you do, because you're thinking within the context of thinking as being your reality, and you're thinking within the physicality of this universe and circumstances being reality. You use the example of being in front of the mirror and claiming you had a full head of hair. That's that's circumstantial evidence, which even in court is considered the least strength of evidence.
I'm a fucking law officer in Texas. I understand the fucking law. But anyway, that's not why I do this, right? It is not why I do this. What I'm trying to tell you, ever so subtly, is that reality for you is your belief in what it is. And then MK, who's bald.
What if?
I'm going to say,
What
hang
if?
on, hang on.
We're running out of time. We are running out of time, and we have a commitment. I have a commitment to end this at 2 hours. And
sorry, I came late, but
well, I know
that invitation thing.
You don't have to apologize.
I don't have my shit together.
The point is that the essence we're talking about is not the physical realm, and yet must be a part of that physical realm. It must be an essence that's indivisible and seemingly impossible to comprehend. And yet the presence must be present if it is in fact present, if it in fact exists. So when I'm talking about reality, I'm talking about an absolute reality. I'm not talking about the reality we've all constructed in our thinking that only is limited to the thinking we do and the physicality. We've talked about it historically as spirituality. We've talked about it as higher knowing. We've talked about it as enlightenment. But I would say it's simply the basis of all of our awareness. It's just a standard operating basis for existence. And if it exists, and I always use the word if, typically, if it exists and we rely on it, there will be an experience that will drastically change from the one we thought we had to have to confirm it, because the confirmation of it will become obvious rather than something that seems to be oblivious, something that seems to be invisible, when in fact something that is indivisible does not need to be seen with our visible eyes, but simply understanding to begin to realize I don't need to come to it if I'm already in no. It's like my eyeball can't see itself. The understanding doesn't need to understand it for it to be, but if I begin to concede that it may exist, it gives my understanding a platform that is rock solid because it isn't changing. The essence of that knowing isn't changing, and I begin to introduce my experience to the being nature of my knowing and awareness rather than simply the thinking I do about that being nature. My sense is we're not struggling with reality. We're not struggling with awareness. We're not struggling with knowing. We're struggling with what we think about those things. I could be wrong, but it is the basis of recovery, and millions of people have recovered as a result of the basic premise of this. And yet we're still not talking about it openly enough to look at it as the central aspect of the disease. And so that's why I talk about it. I don't talk about it because I think I do it well. I talk about it because I want to get better at talking about it. That's all. And yes, I do interrupt. And I am intent on that. And it isn't an accident. It is very, very specific. I do it to help interrupt some of the repetitive nature of the thinking, simply because normally the points that MK was describing, that righteousness, wants to finish the sentence because it thinks, I think when I'm fighting for those thoughts, that if everyone heard it correctly according to my thinking, they would understand what I understand rather than concede. They're going to come to it with their own experience because they already know it. So now I come at this conversation, to this conversation, with a sense that everyone already knows what I'm talking about. And any arguments over that, if they do know it, then the arguments are thoughts that would be inconsistent with that knowing. Doesn't mean they can't have them. It doesn't mean they shouldn't have them. It doesn't mean that they're sane to have them or insane to have them. That's up to everyone to decide. But if we offer each other anything, it would certainly be the perspective of our own experience, because we are sharing the same essence in every way. Even though those every ways aren't different, they're the same. They're just an essence of essence, an essential essence. Something of essence is essential. It's not an option. It's not a negotiation. So that awareness, that knowingness that may seem preposterous, if it exists without doubt, without uncertainty, without conflict, without struggle, because it isn't in parts or pieces. It's an absolute nature that is the nature of nature, existence, and everything. Your guy, JP, in that thing that I listened to some time back at the end of his 2-hour show, which is highly developed. Give me the name of it again, the podcast.
The
guy that talks about aliens and all that. Exometer.
Name is Damia, but he recently came out of the closet, so we actually have his name. I just subscribed to something else he did. But hang on.
Well, in the tail end of the podcast you gave me, he started to reference the absolute awareness. He started to reference this knowingness that transcends all of these other thinkingness that we do that we call reality. He started to represent those things or reference those things. So everyone is free to think what they want.
The Point of Convergence podcast.
Yes, Point of Convergence. So it's interesting to listen to, because the guy's highly intelligent and incredibly well-read.
Incredibly.
And he's talking about things that could seem extremely absurd and insane to people because they're so contrary to the sort of normalcy that we've all fallen prey to, I would suggest. This sort of, if we've normalized abnormality in society, then we're operating on a sick basis thinking it's sane. And that, I would say, is the absolute basis of insanity, especially induced insanity, where we are the choosers of the thought, then the choosers to think the thought's reality, then the choosers to fight and defend the thought and believe that becomes our reality, exclusive to everyone else's reality, and constantly feel at odds to everything and everyone in any subtle way. I'm not talking about glaring, you got to go out and buy a weapon to kill people. I'm talking about the fact that if we're contributing to that line of thinking, we are conspiring with everyone else to maintain the things that allow the circumstances that are happening today that seem to be so absurd and so insane, as though we have nothing to do with them, when we're absolutely playing a part in that process.
Well, that's a thought.
Yes, it's actually a string of them. But yes.
But, I wrote this.
Something to consider.
I wrote this down last week, that because you're analogizing always to this violent conflict, wars must work. They must work for some people, or nobody would bother.
Well, so insanity works for a lot of people, or nobody would bother. And that's my broader point. If we are playing a part in this, we're all playing a part. Doesn't have to be the most significant part to be the one that you're referring to that benefits greatly from the economics and the commercial, the trillions of dollars that's spent on this, because it's got enormous economic incentive. But if we're all playing in that, we're all doing that, it might be worth talking about it to start to see whether or not we want to continue. To the degree that we don't think we have anything to do with it is the same degree that if we're doing something we're ignoring, then we're absolutely playing a part we don't even imagine. And again, insanity becomes a little bit more apparent. Induced insanity is what we're talking about here, not other severe mental conditions that are inherited, biological, etc. And yet, my suspicion is we impose on our biological, physiological, anatomical state conditions that the body doesn't understand what to do with, because they aren't sensible, they aren't reasonable, they're insane. And as a result, the body starts to dysfunction and create all kinds of allergies and inabilities and incapacities, generation to generation to generation, that we alive today are witness to because we are subsequent to every prior generation. If this anxiety and stress has been caused all this time, the pressure creates constriction, which in turn creates inflammation. Seems ironic, but constriction actually leads to inflammation and ends up imposing an impossibility on our organs and our vascular system to function correctly. So digestion becomes difficult, evacuation becomes difficult, constipation becomes common, disease becomes common, and we are absolutely involved in that today. We are participants of it and also the recipients of everything that has happened up until this moment.
Well, what I hope is that you guys don't think I come on this thing to cannibalize the show.
Well, we might, and if we do, so what?
But I give it worth. Remember that.
Just another thought. We're really just sharing thoughts. If thoughts are just thought, the idea that we have an investment in them isn't a surprise. But it also doesn't violate the nature we all have, the love we all have for one another, the absolute state of being that we all share, by making believe that our thoughts somehow are going to preempt all that. They're just thoughts. And to the degree that we can begin to function on that basis, we will become more functionally literate to admit the things that we're all doing rather than the things we think we're each doing. And then we become recipients of the values that we're otherwise denying from the experiences and the relationships that we're having.
So you said something, then I just have one more question and then you can fly. But you said you corrupt because of you're breaking the repetitiveness. Is that true?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, if something is allowed to, if in my experience, if I allow people, if I'm silent in the midst of people telling stories that they're using to excuse themselves from responsibility for what they're doing, I become complicitous by non-action in helping perpetuate the idea that what they're doing is the best thing they can be doing.
And yet,
so they're going to continue.
And yet, when you break in and you interrupt,
it's annoying. People hate it.
No. Right? You break
No,
in.
I know they do. I get to hear about it.
Going on, you give us unyielding repetitiveness.
Yes. Very good. Now, what I'm repeating, though, if an absolute state of being is absolute, the repetition of it is absolutely valid because it is ever present, it is all knowing, it is all awareness. I know you don't believe that, John. I see nobody can see that he's shaking his head. You don't have to don't have to believe in it for it to exist.
Absolute
if what exists,
reality is not reality, truth is not truth. It's your truth, your reality, it's your beliefs.
Well, it's interesting that it has remained while 118, 120 billion people have died. Their reality hasn't taken our reality yet. So there must be a reality that transcends each of our own ideas of reality.
What are you talking about?
What I just said. There's been 120 people to die. And if you're correct, when they died, reality would have gone with them. All that went with them was their opinion of reality. And the same reality they witnessed, we are witnessing today. So there is some evidence at hand, if we're looking at things accurately, that there is something going on that transcends the thinking we do and the bodies we have and the temporal nature of this experience that we're having that may in fact exist right now, not somewhere else when we get after life and all that stuff, but presently. If that is absolutely true, it would be worth noting so that the function of our capacity could begin to function literally, because we would read the signs that we're creating accurately to know when to slow down and speed up and become efficient and effective. Otherwise, we're just flapping our wings and flapping our jaws, and we're not doing much but trying to justify the pettiness of our archaic notions about reality that aren't real and they aren't true. They're just simply ideas thinking they're real and true. And this isn't something that happens to me, it's something done by me. And if I am doing it, the chances are we may all be doing that.
You just watch the guy with the nice hair. Watch his posture just change. Just watch his posture. You know, you watch people, you got to watch his posture. You know,
You have ideas about his posture.
This summary, right, is getting to him, right? And I understand that because I'm watching his ass now, right? I didn't know how to do that, but Anthony showed me.
So as a final note, MK, what was that? What did that posture mean to you?
The accuracy in the comment of the ideas, the realities that we all live within, in theory, would have died when I died.
Yes.
So my grandfather's ancestors, prior, whoever, they all thought they knew everything and everything of how the world was and is. And so in theory, you're right. When they died, then all of that would have died.
If they did know reality, which is why it's still here today. And the other side of the same point you just made is that if it was only reality based on me, that means before I started thinking, there was absolutely no reality.
There was nothing.
So for everybody, so the world and all of you guys only started when I started thinking. You didn't exist otherwise. I would say that would be the grandiosity of ego in this idea that everything depends on me rather than we are all dependent on it, without division, without struggle, without anguish, without stress. None of it would exist in that realm.
JP, that's what I was responding to.
Yeah, I saw it.
You know what's interesting though too,
but I
JP?
saw it.
In psychology, they used to consider folding your arms a refusal, and that now is being seen as hugging yourself. So anyway, we're about 2 hours.
That's why every time I pull over a car,
we're at about 2 hours, and I want to cut it off. But keep in mind,
but I would say, Jack, that this is a 3-beer conversation.
Thanks for coming, you guys. I really got a lot out of it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you guys very much.
Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Ciao, bueno. Ciao, la bella. Bye. Thanks, JP. Thanks, MK. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Jana.
You too.